All right, good evening, and welcome to Big Picture History for Moms and Other Grown-ups. I see that we have a couple dads here at least, maybe two, three, in fact, so welcome to you as well. My name is Mr. Powell. I'm the creator and teacher of History at Our House, and I know some of you here are already using that program. Others are using or are considering trying out Big Picture History, which is a new series that I've created. And I'm offering through quite a nice website called outschool.com that is starting to gain a following out there. And I really like using that site. It allows me to schedule classes such as this one online for folks, and it really facilitates contacting people and so on. And so I'm really enjoying that. And I created this series, Big Picture History, of which this is a little bit of a unique variant for grown-ups, evidently. I created this series because as a teacher, as a historian, and as a teacher, I really have come to identify very clearly that the methods that I use are a departure from the norm, and that the approach that I take to history is very unconventional. And not necessarily very easy for people to decipher. And I'm quite convinced that over time it will be very important for me to continue to offer series like these for adults in order to give you an opportunity to gain a little bit of an exposure to some of what is behind the program, some of what the thinking that goes into these types of lectures, which are unique, and as well as they have been received, it is certainly something that is not usual, and is leading to challenges for some, and so it really is, I think, in my interest to engage with you and to see what your response is, and learn from that. And learn to provide as good of a product as I can for you as well as for your kids, because we're very much all in the same boat. I'm a parent as well as a teacher. My son takes History at Our House classes, and I've been a teacher now for a good 15 years after having been an engineer for many years as well. And I got interested in history as an engineer, finding that all of that scientific and engineering type of knowledge that I had, as useful as it was in a technical capacity, was just had not and could not possibly prepare me to understand the society that I was in and how it was evolving. And I found myself increasingly turning to the humanities, trying to put together a comprehensive picture of the world. And it's taken me an extremely long time, much longer than I would have guessed would be possible. It's literally been over 20 odd years now that I've been working the problem of history. And I found it to be an almost intractable problem in academia and in the conventional sense, because, as I've learned through the study of not merely history, but even more specifically the history of history, that as much as we are accustomed to looking at the past in a certain way, given the premises that are driving historiography in the modern era, as much as we're accustomed to that, the way that people think of history today is actually quite unusual, historically speaking. It is not in keeping with the original ideas of the inventors of history, the ancient Greeks. It is not at all compatible with or in keeping with the historical thinking of people, for instance, during the Renaissance, or people during the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers in particular. So we have a tendency in modern times to engage in a perspective which has been called by historians the presumption of modernity. And I find that to be a particularly apt term. And I find myself at this juncture really having engaged with history so deeply over such an extended period of time, realizing that, in fact, the reason why I hated history and the reason why the vast majority of people eventually just simply turn away from it and this is going to happen to every one of our kids if they have the conventional treatment, okay, is because this historiographical premise out there that animates the profession today, which is that the past is a value in and of itself, and that therefore what we do when we study history is we merely study it. We look at it, we gaze upon it, we are there to contemplate the past, and that somehow we get a form of culturation by doing that, by exposing ourselves to things from the past. And this is a very ineffable type of premise, but the idea is that we gain something of that nature. It's very abstract and ineffable. But the truth is, and the way that most people respond quite rightly to that scenario is they end up just leaving it alone. They just give up on it because there is no genuine connection with how we engage with the world around us, the way that history is presented today. The academic subject, the subject that we present to our kids through textbooks and those other entirely dry and stale formats and so on, and the types of tests that we ask them to take and the types of things that we ask them to memorize, they really are useless. And that is that creates a serious conflict for them as learners. And eventually the natural response, which I had as a child, and I'm pretty sure you had as well, is that we set it aside. We might not be able to articulate what's wrong, and we might not be able to even challenge our teachers, and we might not be able to challenge historians because they have all kinds of, they have really quite a sophisticated intellectual apparatus that's backing them up in what they do. It just happens to be wrong. And it happens to be aberrant historically, even though, as I said, we find ourselves in that context and we assume that that's the way that it is. It's not. And the way that history is done today is profoundly flawed, and history education is profoundly broken. And so I have been struggling with this my entire adult life. And I have come to the conclusion that thanks to studying the history of history and studying other examples of people engaging with the past and trying to make sense of it, that there's another approach, and that that properly pursued, what we need to be doing with the past is indeed integrating it with the present. We need to be pursuing knowledge of the past in a manner that honors our very nature, our very human nature. As human beings, we have this capacity that goes beyond right, any other kind of living being. We have this ability to experience the world, not merely in the moment, but to summon an awareness of the past, either through memory or through accumulated knowledge and writing and so on. And we have the ability to summon that and to focus on it here in the present moment. And we have the ability to process that in conjunction with our very broad awareness of things that are happening at this time all over the place to us and to others, and in anticipation of things that are to come. And this ability that we have is just phenomenal. It is a component of our reasoning capacity, and we need a subject that honors that. And so my vision of history is one that provides us not merely hindsight. The way that historians operate today is very much focused exclusively on hindsight, but rather on insight into the way the world is today, and foresight into the way that it is being transformed. So that's my vision, and as I said, it's in keeping with the idea of history that a variety of generations of thinkers have had over time, including most notably the founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson looked upon history as an indispensable subject. I mean, you couldn't possibly be more removed from how people think of history today than looking at it this way. I mean, as I like to call it with the kids, I like to tell them, I think of history as the MVS, the most valuable subject. And that's how Thomas Jefferson felt. That's how the founding fathers felt. And they just provide us with such beautiful examples of thinking with regard to the past. I mean, if you read the speeches of Patrick Henry, or you look at the reasoning of James Madison in the Federalist Papers, and you look at Thomas Jefferson's summoning of history in his writings and even in the Declaration of Independence, it is staggering how real and compelling and empowering the past was to these people. And the results, the proof is in the pudding, as we say. They were empowered to do things that really no other human beings in history have ever accomplished. And we, on the other hand, are quite at a loss as to how to deal with the world that we're in as a society. And you can sense it in the type of discourse that American society engages in is really of a very low intellectual order, quite frankly. It's not impressive at all. We're going to get to that shortly here. So it's not very, I know that's not very gracious of me to say, but as a historian, I feel completely that I have a right to say that compared to what I know to have been the intellectual standard of prior societies. And so, yeah, like I said, this presumption of modernity is something that I'm here to challenge. And the way that I look upon this, right, this idea that I want to present students with a vision of history that connects to the present. What I recognize, and I've seen in my own work and introspected in my own studies, is that the reason why, assuming that we're looking for something that matters, assuming that we aren't addicted to kind of this stale sort of academic pursuit of just more and more information. But assuming we are looking for something that actually does inform our perspective of the world, the reason why we struggle so much to do that with history is that history is a plethora. This is my favorite word for describing the challenge that we face. It is literally a cognitive challenge in the sense that we face, as we attempt to contend with the past, we face an overabundance or an excess of information. That we face so much, and if we look at the panorama that is human history, it is so overwhelmingly large. It consists of 5,000 plus information, 5,000 years plus information for all of the various countries of the world added up. I mean, it's an absolutely staggering sum, and there's absolutely no way that we can process it in its raw form. There's absolutely no way that we can process it even in the form that historians present it to us. And so it's just an overwhelming overabundance. It's impossible to handle. And so this is the fundamental problem, I would say, that we encounter, which is what leads people to this coping strategy of simply trying to learn X or Y or Z, these little isolated things in the past, is because the sum is so big that what people do is they tend to focus in on something that has a little bit of a compelling quality to them. And they become kind of stranded in that particular subject or area, especially academic historians, as you might know. I mean, what they end up doing is hyper-focusing on some extremely small little bit of thing. And if you look, sorry, I know this will maybe seem a little bit ungracious, but again, if you engage with these professionals of history, and you look at them and you ask them, or you try to understand what is the benefit that they're getting from that. Do they have some sense or awareness of the world that we're in? Do they navigate through that? And do they provide our society with any significant guidance as to how to proceed as a civilization to define a better set of values? The answer is no. They're in their cloistered ivory towers, and they can barely function as normal human beings, except in that particular hyper-specialized field, whatever it is that they study. There's a malfunction there. Right? This is not what the outcome should be for us. It's not a healthy intellectual outcome. I'm excited about the potential for penetrating the plethora and for presenting a vision of the human past that is accessible and that is compelling to students of all ages. And so my offering to you in Big Picture History consists of this entire set and more. which I think are all, in the end, accessible to students and worth learning. And the ultimate outcome here can be truly a synoptic awareness of the world, and a very empowering one that allows you, to observe what is happening in Brazil, a country that is going to experience some incredible setbacks after the Olympics are all over. What is happening in Britain, people who just voted to leave the European Union. What is happening in the Middle East with the struggle there as that culture tries to adapt to its subordinacy to the West. What is happening in China with its incredible industrial rise. What is happening in Russia in its post-communist phase of history, and so on. All of these things are completely at my fingertips as a historian, and should be at everybody's fingertips as very accessible, knowable topics. The world doesn't have to be a mystery to us and completely anxiety-inducing set of CNN headlines that just tells us that everything's awful. And so that's my mission here in very adult terms, evidently, right? I don't speak in these terms when I present American history to my students. I speak as much as possible on an age-appropriate level and communicate to them in a way that obviously is intended to be appropriate for their learning. This, what I'm trying to present to you today, is much more of an explanation of how, right? Not just what, but how. And so, yes, I'm going to present a little bit of American history material here in particular, because that is that's my lens for discussing kind of the concretes that I intend to present in particular as I discuss the principles involved here. But I definitely do want to focus on the method, because what I allow students to do through big picture history is as I do allow them to penetrate through that plethora, and I suspect for the first time ever in most of their experiences, which is why I get this excitement from a lot of kids. They're really feeling like all of a sudden the past is making sense in a whole new way that they hadn't imagined it could do. And I'm very happy when I managed to reach a 16 or a 17-year-old student who at that point is already very jaded and is feeling like, oh, I've got to take that AP test and my life is a misery, and I want to get into college, and then hopefully my parents can never force me to study history again. I'm really pleased when I can reach that student and maybe give them a sense, oh, there's something else out there. And then hopefully also I really enjoy working with the younger students, because I can intercept them before it's too late, and maybe they can have year after year of exposure to a way of thinking about the past that's genuine, and that really gives them access to the world around them rather than something that's disconnected from that world. So it's really crucial in order to do that. I mean, how do I do it? How do I present the past to them? Well, I have an explicit and systematic standard of selectivity. In other words, when I approach the past, I always do it the same way. I have a methodology. It is explicit and it is systematic. I think that is the most empowering feature of big picture history and history at our house. It's not haphazard. It's not random. It is very, very systematic. It's absolutely ruthless, in fact. And the standard is, in a word, it is importance. So importance is a very interesting concept, philosophically speaking. When we talk about things that are important, as we judge things to be important or not, that's a particular category of value judgment. It's not the same as moral or political value judgments. And I find a lot of parents get confused on that point. A lot of parents feel as though the driving value judgments in historiography are moral or political. And so they get upset if there's something in history that has perhaps a triggering content to them, and they feel as though it doesn't quite fit with their political point of view. They often are kind of upset by that particular aspect. They don't necessarily understand that the key to history is not whether we like it or not. the key to history is not whether or not it's comfortable to us or whether or not it confirms our particular values or not. History is a form of studying the world. It's a form of cognition. It's a form of knowledge acquisition. And what we have to do when we're studying the past is we have to figure out of that plethora, right, what is worth our time at all? That's the most fundamental question that we have to answer, not whether or not something is good or bad. Because, and my students are really clear on this, it's really obvious to kids, right? That you have to study some things that are nice, and you have to study some things that aren't. And that includes things like slavery and terrorism and war and all of the various other forms of inhumanity that human beings have concocted that sadly characterize history. They're out there and they're important. And that's the key word, you see. As I like to tell my students, important is the most important word in history, as I like to tell them. And what do I mean by that? I mean, of course, important is not like a self-contained abstraction. If you say that something is important, you're implying that it's important to somebody and for some purpose, right? So importance to whom and for what is the question that follows if I tell you that that my standard of selectivity is historical importance. And the answer is this: important to us all. It's not a subjective study. The only way to get an objective outcome in history is if we focus on the things that are of universal significance, important to us all. Here and now, because we're in the present, there's no other place we can be. There's no other place where we can return with our historical knowledge and summon it and use it for any purpose. So the history that I teach, if you want to have a term to name all of this and really summarize it in one particular form, you could use the term present-centric. A lot of people are concerned with the issue of bias or centricity in history, so-called. And my approach is very simple, is simply that. I call it present centrism. So it means I'm interested in what matters to us now, right? In order to understand the world here and now, the world we live in. That becomes the standard of selectivity. And what I do is, once I identify what is of fundamental significance, I look for the information from the past that allows us to identify this world more carefully, more closely, more correctly, that gives us insight into the phenomenon that we are seeing around us, gives us also instruction or lessons that will allow us to interpret what's going on and anticipate what's coming. And it all makes sense in the end. And that goes for everything that's happening today. It's all entirely predictable. I mean, I don't mean to be flippant or too, let's say, claim too much with regard to the powers of history. But everything that's happening today, whether we're talking about the stalled revolution in Egypt, whether we're talking about the absolutely perverse sequence of events in which Turkey is radically changing to this day, and of course Syria and Libya and so on, and Ukraine, and some of these flashpoints around the world, China and its argument with Japan over the Senkaku Dayu Islands and various other threads. I mean, they're all completely understandable. There's nothing there that is not understandable in terms of history. In fact, with history, they become just so obvious, and the world makes sense. And so that's what I'm looking for, right? I'm looking for anchor facts that give us that kind of clarity. And so, focusing on American history now, with that having been said, right, how do I work it? Well, I go right to where we are. And I say to the kids, look, this is America now, whether you like it or not. And Americans are going to be choosing a president, and that presidential choice is going to have global significance. And so that's what we need to pay attention to. Right? It's not a personal preference. It's a historical truth that this is where we are. And it is also the case that given the fact that the United States is the world police power, that whatever the choice is that Americans make has incredible global universal significance, in particular in relation to the fact that the United States is currently struggling with this gargantuan challenge that is to try to police the world in the context of the emergence of this new phenomenon of terrorism. And so how do we understand this world? How did we get here? You know, when I was a kid, and I assume, you know, we're around the same age, let's say, right? When we were kids, this wasn't our world. We were all around when this happened. And we stood in front of the TV, and we knew, everyone here knew, the world was never going to be the same, right? You knew that. You knew that we were literally going to enter into a different phase of history. You might not have been able to name it at that time, but you felt it deep inside. And it certainly has come to pass, right? That we are living now in a whole new era. And that's absolutely undeniable, right? I mean, it's a different world. And it is a global phase of history that has definitely accelerated, and we're really experiencing a crescendo lately of just in terms of the quantity of things that are happening, and it's not going away. I'm not here to prescribe, but I can tell you as a historian that the United States is not winning. The United States is not succeeding in its efforts, and so we're going to have more. And so we have to contend with this, right? As a historian, that really is my responsibility to everybody that I can teach, is to say, okay, what kind of world do you live in? And why? How did it come to be this way? So now one thing that I tell the kids, though, as I embark on this, you know, study of history, and I begin to present to them these anchor facts, and I highlight that at every juncture, right? One thing that I highlight with the kids, though, is even though this is the case, we live in an amazing time. And so I don't want you to get the impression that just because I have a lot of complaints about the way that history is done nowadays, and I have a lot of complaints about the whole educational sphere, and I have a lot of complaints about American foreign policy and American government in general, and so on and so forth. Who doesn't, right? But I mean, but at the same time, I tell the kids, we live in a wonderful world. And that this is a very empowering truth that history provides us with as well. I find that, you know, my awareness, what I know about history, gets me out of bed in the morning, literally. It allows me to not be overwhelmed by what I see on the web, and not have that anxiety that's typically induced by the headlines for a lot of people. It really anchors my awareness of what's going on now in the totality of human experience, and it gives me a certain serenity with regard to what's going on. And that I also try to teach the kids, right? That this big picture awareness that you can grasp, it gives you a kind of internal datums of stability for yourself, and an awareness of what human beings have done over time, how amazing it is what we've accomplished so far collectively, and how amazing the world is, and how wonderful it is despite all the problems. And so when I highlight this theme, you know, I don't get into gloom and doom, and I don't try to present a negative worldview at all. I just present this as a fact. I present this as a distinctive feature of the world that we're in. And I challenge the students to think of it in these terms. I say, okay, how did we get here? Why is the world like this? And I proceed to show them. So now I'm not going to presume to give you like a really, really basic treatment here of American history in the same way, right? I think that if you want to follow along with the kids in big picture American history in one lesson, you absolutely can. I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of quickly pass through the milestones that I do indicate are relevant here. And I don't mind at all if you're not really knowledgeable about these things. If you want to stop me at any juncture, you can go ahead. But the essence of the presentation that I give, in the initial presentation that I give, is this: that we are where we are today because we're talking about the United States, a country that was born in 1776, a country that embodied certain principles that were enunciated by the founding fathers, And of course, those included the idea of natural rights, and also the idea that a republic, which the United States is, should maintain its political separation from the world. And that's the concept of the Monroe Doctrine, which animated American government for well over half of American history, if you include the earlier period in which all the founding fathers agreed on this point. And then that allowed America to evolve independently, right? And to tackle the hard issues that were there at the founding, including the inheritance of slavery, which was just a global and pervasive phenomenon in all human civilizations. And the United States inherited that from Europe, had to resolve the contradiction of slavery and rights. And it was very difficult to do. But finally it was jettisoned, and of course it took the Civil War to accomplish that. And I walk students through that progression and explain that we come to the modern America, an America in which the discourse really centers around the concept of civil rights, precisely because of the Civil War and the consequences of that: emancipation, the granting of citizenship to former slaves, and the granting of the right to vote, and so on. And we are still very much, American society is still very much working through the consequences of how that was done, what the successes and failures were there. American society is the way that it is very much because of that. But evidently on a broader scale, on a global scale, America is where it is because it then, having emerged from that national infancy and that period of maturation that was required as an independent nation, it then stood up and said, well, at least Woodrow Wilson did, and then Americans gradually became very much, came to accept fundamentally what he enunciated in World War I. And the United States became a country that was on a mission to try to make the world a better place. And so I walk the students through, of course, the major milestones that have carried us through precisely to where we are now, because the United States fought in the world wars. It was literally the decisive player in both of those and saved the world from itself, and then had to face this enormous challenge, which was what to do about the threat of communism, what to do with its former ally, the Soviet Union, and the expansion of communism as a threat to people around the world. And the United States chose at that point to enact a policy of policing, rather than withdrawing into its own affairs and then permitting things to go so terribly awry around the world that a World War III would be required. The United States began to act in such a manner to try to forestall that, to try to prevent that, to try to keep the conflicts at a minimum. And so the United States became a police power. And then I explained to the students, of course, the scope of the Soviet Union, and I talk about the different vectors of the expansion of communism, and that leads us to the discussion of how the United States became entangled in the affairs of the Middle East. And as we know, that has ultimately resulted in this unique response of people that want to try to prevent and in fact deflect America's power from that overarching presence that it has in the Middle East. Jihadists in particular, as they're called, right, have this very, very desperate program of trying to use terrorism to affect America's policy decisions and change Americans' mind on how they act in the world. So that is the adult version, right, and a very accelerated one at that, of the type of information that gets presented in big picture history. And so this is called an anchor fact timeline. This is a device that I use, and I guide the students much more slowly, much more deliberately. I ask them a lot of questions. I interact with them very directly in order to allow them to see, right, this progression for themselves and to understand how the modern day America was shaped by this progression. And so then what I do at the very end, which is really important to all of you here, is I lay out a framework for building on that foundation. Because what I do in big picture history necessarily is introductory, is a very broad brushstroke type of approach. There's no way that you could do more in any sensible regard. It would not make sense to present more facts because they just tend to accumulate and they become overwhelming. We can encounter a plethora in a cognitive sense. We can get overwhelmed very easily. In fact, with just basically few more facts than this. So I don't like to present more. This is all we need, really, in essence, to understand how we got to be where we are now. But of course, there's so much more. And so I don't mean to suggest through the structuring of the big picture presentations that there isn't that much more and that much richer narratives to be pursued in history, because there absolutely are. And of course, I mean, part of the way to know that and experience that is to learn more through the big picture histories. And so I've already offered the US, China, Europe, the Islamic world, and Canada. So those are my first 5, and multiple others are coming down the pipeline. I'm going to be turning to the ancient history topics in September, and then probably at a pace of about 2 to 3 and sometimes 4 per month even, I'll be generating these. And so I intend to offer a full spectrum of courses for people to pursue there. But again, still at an introductory level. So what really matters about big picture history is where you go from there, right? Once you get the fundamental progression, once you see that history can be built up in that fashion, where do you go from there is really the most important question of all. And so one thing that I offer immediately for anybody that wants to pursue the topic at a higher level is I labeled it here level 2, but what I really mean, it's called Advanced American History in One Lesson. And you can grab that on OutSchool right away once you take Big Picture History. That is available to anybody that uses Big Picture History. So it's a great way to follow up. I've already had 2 sessions of that with students. And they and their parents have really appreciated the opportunity to see how the big picture framework expands. I'm going to show you a little bit more about that shortly here. But there are also other options. And one of the things that occurs to people to ask, of course, in this big picture history context is, well, this seems a little restrictive. Perhaps, where's the context for all of this? Aren't there other things that we should learn as well? And the answer is absolutely, right? There's no intention here to presume to say there's nothing else that matters. I love to explore pretty much everything that history has to offer. So one good example of that is, and one of my favorite ways to explore some of the other topics that don't necessarily fit in the core narrative, in the most fundamental progressions. One way that I like to do that is history through art. And so I just offered a couple sessions of this with some students as well that had gone through big picture history. And that's a lot of fun, because it allows us to just luxuriate a little bit, to slow down and to look at certain facets of various cultures and to spend some time talking about that. We just had a great class because there's a great sculptor named Herman Atkins McNeil, and he created some really wonderful sculptures that depict Native Americans and that have some themes in there that are really challenging. And it gives a chance to engage on topics that are a little bit more peripheral, a little bit different, and make sure that we don't lose sight of those things in history as well. But of course, then the fundamental is, in general, how do we maintain a synoptic awareness of the past? How do we not get lost, or as I like to say, stranded in the past? When we get into those deeply detailed narratives, and we can very much get kind of stuck in that stuff, and then we lose track of the connection between past and present. How do we keep it? And so in the Big Picture History series, this is kind of the direction that it takes. I teach students in the Advanced American History. Here you can see the milestones that are in common between the original story and the follow-up. This is the content that I present in Advanced American History in One Lesson. And it is literally double the content. It is literally double the number of facts. As I like to put it, the resolution of the story doubles. And the way that it is absolutely necessary for us to maintain our overall awareness, our big picture awareness of history, is to engage in a process that that modern day historians are very shaky on, but which is incredibly empowering. It's called periodization. And it's not merely a matter of assigning names to various chapters in history and just sort of dividing it up artificially. It's a much more powerful cognitive method than most people realize. It's absolutely essential in order to process the past in a more and more abstract capacity. And over time, the better you are at studying history, the more you're able to periodize the various chapters of history and see how they interconnect with one another. And that becomes a really, truly empowering awareness. This, of course, is still only an early form of awareness, but you can go from there and you can keep on building. And so that's what, of course, in the end, I'm all about. My goal is to help students build an integrated body of knowledge that informs them about the world that they live in. In an American history context, what do I have to offer? I have a curriculum that teaches American history at multiple levels. And so American history is offered for students from 2nd to 12th grade. And then for students that do well in that and that get through to the high school years and are ready to move on, I offer a high-level course called American Government, and that is a very specific, very detailed study of the evolution of the American government over time. And so those are American government courses that are available, American history courses that are available. And they fit in a cycle of teaching that I provide to kids, which includes every year one course that's done live. So if you've had exposure to big picture history and you want to know where to go from there, I mean, really, this is the answer. If you want a type of history that constantly fosters that type of awareness of a past that is not disconnected from the present, of a past that is not self-sufficient, but rather one that informs us, gives us insight into the present, and helps us to understand where things are headed, then the live component of the class is absolutely the best option for kids. And on Monday, I start the new year. So on Monday, August 22nd, European history is the part of the cycle that I'm teaching. And it's a great experience for both kids and for parents. In particular, what I wanted to say, just as a parting, as a concluding remark here, especially for you, if you're interested in some of what is being presented here, right? In essence, a really crucial thing that you can do as a homeschooling parent is you can take these classes with your kids, and I find that a lot of parents really enjoy doing that because they're getting the education that they should have gotten, the one that I know I would have wanted to get and didn't get and had to build for myself. But you can have it as well if you're accompanying your kids in the program. So that is available to you as well. Okay, so that's what I have to say about big picture history, and obviously with an American history focus. This is the type of thing that I'm presenting to the kids. This is the content they're going to get in that original big picture history. This is where you can take it. And so hopefully that gives you some insight into how this is all working, and it helps you to understand why it's already been just wildly successful. I'm really thrilled with how it's gone, and I think it will be, it can continue to be a really great component of your history education and your kids' history education, if you want to embrace it and participate in it. So. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving me a chance to explain what is behind this program. And so appreciate the opportunity. And so now I'm done, and I'm just going to let you guys see if you have had anything occur to you over the course of the presentation, and if you want to talk about anything like that in particular, let's go ahead. So Mike was first there, and Mike is only on the chat. So hold on there, Mike. Your question Do I think the Monroe Doctrine was right? Or is the Truman Doctrine right, where we police the world? Oh, Mike, ask me the easy questions, why don't you? Do I think it's right? You see, now that becomes very challenging. So now we're comparing, almost comparing apples and oranges there in a sense, because we're comparing different eras. And we're comparing quite different cultures and different contexts. But nonetheless, if you want me to opine in this particular view, because there's no way that I could possibly back up my particular position on this, it really just has to be an assertion, right? I think the founders had it right. In the sense that the policy that they pursued was one of rational self-interest. And it was not, the world be damned, but it was nonetheless, I think, fundamentally correct as a posture to the world. And I think that the intractability of the problem that America faces today, I think this entanglement is the exact word that George Washington used with regard to, it was prescient, really, what he predicted would happen if America did not follow the policy of political separation. The entanglement that America currently exhibits, it's a quagmire, and it just leads to the most awful outcomes on a constant basis. It's really just demoralizing to Americans. It causes American society to be, in essence, at war with itself. And it demoralizes people all around the world, in effect, as well. With the way that America conducts the war on terror is profoundly flawed, and people can poke holes in it just left and right, politically and with both hands. So I do fundamentally identify with the Monroe Doctrine. And I think that it's fascinating to see in American culture as people try to contend with, what is going on today, and to try to figure out, well, what could we do with this? Is there something, that we could? Is there something we could go back to? What would George Washington do? Would be a really good question for Americans to be asking themselves right now. So yes, that is my opinion. So Hadley, what's on your mind?
I was just wondering, so our oldest is 5, and can we purchase some of the
No, I'm sorry, Hadley. You're cutting in and out.
We'll buy it.
What? Sorry, what was that? Oh, you're okay. You're gonna type. Okay, yeah, I would prefer that because your audio is just really atrocious there. I can't understand anything. Yeah, so don't rush. Naveen and Melanie are gonna fire away here with a question. You can go ahead and write me a little paragraph, and I'll turn to that in just a moment. Naveen, Melanie, go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Paul, Melanie here.
Yeah.
I have 3 kids that will be taking your new history at our house this fall.
Right.
And Leo and Sarah are going to be in the junior high level.
Yeah, right. I was thinking about that because he's older now. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have that wrong. It's Jack and Kira in the upper elementary. Leo's in the junior high.
Right.
I'm just curious, how different will those courses be, and how will that show up in Leo's? Because we're very familiar with your upper elementary.
Yeah.
So what's
right.
different about the junior?
Right. Okay. Good question. So what's different? On the surface, it's kind of obvious what's different. The classes last an extra 15 minutes. So, right. It's longer, which means to some extent there's a little bit more. You'll notice that fundamentally the content is the same. In an ideal world, it actually would not be. In an ideal world, I would actually, and have had an opportunity in the past, to alter the nature of the content within a certain range as students move up through the program. And so I really would love to be able to help kids, starting at age 7, and then I've even had some, I think Hadley's going to ask about this. I even had some really brilliant students start at 5, but usually around 7 or 8. And then what happens is they go through the cycle over and over again. And I've had students do that almost from start to finish. So I've had students go through upper L, junior high, and high school. So that's 3 cycles. So that's higher and higher levels of abstraction. And the results are really stunning. Just the awareness, you can see what they can do intellectually. And it's just phenomenal. And that is the ideal if the students can go through the process that way. And as much as I can, I try to tailor the presentation to that evolving context. But here's my challenge right now. I don't have enough of a kind of, a starter group. I don't have enough parents joining the program for their kids at age 7 or 8, so that I don't have students that are well enough equipped to be able to have that experience. So you will find that the junior high students are getting quite a serious amount of backfilling because they don't know history. And it's really sad, but parents are doing their best. But you get a kid to read the story of the world and the regular books out there that are available, and you might have a sense at a certain juncture that things are okay and they're okay with it. But in the end, the outcome is almost null. And that is discouraging ultimately, right? And then people keep trying to find solutions to this pedagogical predicament. And then I do end up getting a lot of incoming students that are in that boat. And then I've got to teach to them. I've got to do my best to kind of teach to a context that is broad. And so as a result, the junior high content is kind of very, it's very similar to the upper L content, except that, and it's not the same, except that I'm definitely more demanding in terms of the intellectual rigor that I expect from the students. So the questions that I ask have more parts to them. The interpretive challenges that I put to them are more significant. And the integrations that I expect them to perform are more complex, right? So I'm working with the same fundamental material, but I am definitely demanding of them that they step it up. And so, yeah, I think you will see that, especially if you kind of do a little side by side with the tests. You'll see the upper L test and you'll see the junior high test, and you'll see, obviously it's a page longer, right? But it's not just that. You'll see that the content is more intensive. The treatment of every topic is more complex. So it's very much an age dependent, and not so much age, but more capability dependent, right? Incremental increase in the level of difficulty. Yeah, so you'll see it. It'll definitely be there. But the good thing about having students doing both is they'll still be able to talk. And then on occasion, the young kids will get something that the older ones didn't, and they'll still have really cool discussions. And it's great when you can have that, that dinner table discussion and everybody's able to contribute. And the younger ones feel like they're talking with the older ones and they know stuff too. And that's really cool when you have I've had a lot of multi-level families in the program as well. And they just have a blast because, the young kids are processing stuff in their own way, and they do an amazing amount. We severely underestimate what young kids can do. And as far as history is concerned, it really, really shows. When I teach kids history, what they can do, it just blows me away sometimes, what my young son can do. So I think you'll enjoy having them at different levels. Okay, now let me get to Hadley's discussion here. She chatted to me a little bit of content. So your youngest is 5. And then you said, could we do the 7-year-old program now as a family, as an intro to history for a 5-year-old? And then she could do your course when she's actually 7. Or oldest is 5. Okay, right, oldest is 5. Okay, so you're wondering, okay, is it too soon kind of to jump in? Or is there something you could recommend for us to start with, pique her interest now before she's 7? Yeah. There's no way to know what a 5-year-old can do without knowing them. So I don't know who that 5-year-old is. Like I said, I've had 5-year-olds move up into my lower elementary class as a teacher. When I was teaching at Van Dam Academy in Southern California, I had some amazing Montessori kids coming up at 5. They were exceptional though. And that's quite an exceptional school. So their context was unique, and they were doing stuff that's really advanced. So whether or not, I don't expect most 5-year-olds to be able to handle this. My son, just for comparison's sake, my son started when he was 7. So, I didn't push him earlier than that. He was doing just fine in his Montessori, and I didn't feel as much as I do definitely advise parents that they have a tendency to wait too long when it comes to history, and that one of the most important pieces of advice I have to parents is start early. That there is such a thing as the history habit. And if you can get your kids into history at our house early, they will develop it. You won't have to fix their how upset they are about this boring subject. They'll get it right from the start. And that's wonderful if you can have it. And there's only so much magic I can do. When I get a junior high kid, honestly, I have managed to turn some around. I have gotten some 13, 14, 15-year-old students, and they are not terribly engaged, but they get a spark, and it starts to turn around for them. And I really feel great when that happens, because I feel as though they're not going to have that experience that I had. They don't have to go all the way to college and then struggle as young adults to put it back together again for themselves. They're finally getting at least some exposure when they're young, and that's already helping them. But yeah, starting early is good, but I can't know. I guess if I had to, try to provide you with an answer, it would be this. I would say, try it. Try it. You can subscribe via monthly payment, so you don't have to buy the whole thing in advance. You can subscribe, and it's probably too soon, but you can try and see how it goes. And so that would be just one possibility. And if it doesn't work, one really crucial thing I would say is, if 5 is too early, please do not worry about that. Just don't fret over that issue. Like I said, my son was 7 when he started. It was actually pretty tough for him for his first year. At 8, going on 9, that's when he really, he was much more successful, even at the lower elementary class. So I don't have a problem with people waiting to that point. I just really worry about kids when they're already 11 or 12 and they haven't had any good history classes yet. That's when they're already starting to sour on the whole thing. So that's kind of what I have to say on that. I don't. If you have any follow up on that, let me know. Naveen, Melanie, did you have something else?
Yeah, Mr. Powell, this is Naveen here. Just a follow on Mike's question. Can you comment on the practicality of politically non-interventionist policy in a world of today where we're so connected and we still want to have free trade and open borders and stuff, because that comes down to individual rights.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And with terrorism going on and things like that.
Yeah, I'm not going there. That is a very sophisticated question, Naveen, and so it speaks well to your understanding of the challenges involved, which are very considerable. And I find that there are people today that speak about what is mistermed but often referred to as isolationism, and the discourse, as I said, when it comes to those topics is unfortunately not very impressive, and so it's just that's beyond where I want to go here. So yeah, and who would I vote for? Ooh, I am not talking about that. This is not politics, and I do not want to alienate anybody on that basis. My journey when it comes to history is very focused on the idea that there's common ground here for us. I mean, it's not a Republican versus Democrat thing. The question of the fate of America, and of the world, and it should be something that everybody should want to learn. It's not a fundamentally ideological construct, history. It is a cognitive endeavor, and we should. It should be possible for us to build some common ground on that. Okay, so. Clarinda, I appreciate your comment there. I should run. Oh my God, no. Politics is just unconscionably awful. And so I no interest in that whatsoever. Naveen, Melanie, more?
Melanie again, sorry. This might be more of a philosophical question than a pedagogical, but I do have a question about how you really do such a great job about bringing in the past, explain the present, and maybe see what's going to be sort of in the future. I'm wondering if we can, with our kids, can we talk to them about how these previous wars were fought and won, what we can bring to today's, I know it's politics, right? But what can we bring to today's challenge of trying to get on top of this that we learned from these previous wars, and how much can we talk about with them, and where do you stand on this, I guess, too, in your own classes?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so what you're talking about there in general, the category that you're referring to there is a slightly different type of outcome that is absolutely indispensable when it comes to history. But if you notice, the focus, as you said, in my pedagogical approach, is towards what I call insight. It's a type of integration. And it's along the past-present axis. So in other words, I'm looking for the causal connections, right, between past and present fundamentally. There's a progression there. There's an interweaving of events. They lead us to this complex thing that is the present. That is a type of reasoning. That's a type of integration. What you're referring to there is another kind, also valuable. But I'm very convinced that it has to be engaged in the context of the prior integration. In other words, if you engage in the type of cognition you're talking about, which is example-based reasoning and integration and generalization and pulling out what we call the lessons of history, okay? So I use the term instruction. If you're trying to gain instruction from the past, I definitely believe that's very important to do. But I observe that we live in a society that people are always trying to gain instruction from the past and are failing miserably. And how do I explain that? Including people that are really well-meaning and people that are very well-equipped philosophically and otherwise, and they fail miserably. And my answer for why that doesn't work is because what's missing is the proper past-present integration. So in my own work, I very much emphasize, in my own thinking, perhaps even overemphasize the past-present connection. I'm always thinking in that particular way. And then I find that as far as the lessons of history are concerned, they kind of flow out of that and they kind of naturally present themselves. And I don't have any really, really strong point of view on you as a parent and whether or not you want to engage with your kids on, let's say, the lessons of World War I or the lessons of World War II and so on. I guess I would caution a little bit against that in the sense that it's too easy to have an oversimplified version of the past and then to generalize or abstract prematurely. And so it's a complex art. And so that is just one thing that I would say. I would caution against it in that sense, because I see it all the time in the culture that we live in. People, whether it's the New York Times editorial or never mind, wherever it is, the type of instructional use of history is really flawed, really, really deeply flawed. And what's missing is the broader context and the ability to understand when you're summoning the examples, how they really fit, how they really apply, rather than how you might prefer that they apply based on your own political point of view or your presuppositions. And so you end up with a completely subjective outcome. And so, even if you mean well, and it's just it's of no particular value. So yeah, it's a tricky thing. And whenever I can, I do try, I challenge the students to talk about the lessons that I can see. And you're certainly welcome to do that. I don't think there's any really enormous damage you can do if you're trying to encourage that type of more philosophical thinking in your kids. But the one problem that you will run into is if you are trying to do that sort of thing in a context in which you haven't established the proper context and you're not quite aware that you haven't done it, because how could you? I mean, you have to have a certain level of expertise in the material to know, are you parameterizing these questions properly, right? And a lot of people do it in an oversimplified manner. That's kind of the one warning that I do have. And so, when Mike was asking me Monroe Doctrine versus Truman Doctrine, did you know? I mean, you notice my first answer was to kind of hedge everything that I have to say on context, because the contexts are so different. They're radically different. And therefore, it's way too easy to state answers in a facile or oversimplified form. And we see that all the time in politics, and it's really of no particular value to us. So that is something that I generally shy away from. Okay. All right. Well, those were interesting questions. Some of them a little bit on the tricky side there, but I appreciate that. Anything else? Hadley, one more perhaps? If you have one to chat to me, one more. I think I'm going to cut it off at this point because this is past my bedtime, if you didn't know. So I am excited. I always enjoy it. This could keep me up for hours, but I definitely am hitting my limit here. So go ahead and chat me one more, and I'll try one more. So choose one if you can't answer both. Okay, what is it? I'll try to answer them short. How about that? Sometimes I'm just too wordy. Oh, the two above. Oh my gosh. Oh, okay. Course for adults if they want to experience history in a better way, preferably not live. That's a tricky one, because I have done courses for adults, but I'm not that happy with them anymore. So they're out there, and there was some good stuff, but I have really changed my approach over time, and there will be a time when I just discontinue that stuff. So it's a tough one to answer. I guess I would suggest that you might like to take, the History at Our House classes by recordings yourself. I really do believe very strongly in that product for adults. So, it's the kind of thing you can listen to on your commute, and it's really accessible to adults, and it really benefits adults as well. I really have no qualms about recommending History at Our House for adults. And then how long does it take you to cover the material you showed us tonight on that timeline? Oh, well, American history. Oh, well, it depends what you're asking. Big picture history is a 1-hour class. So this timeline takes an hour to do with the kids, including all the preface and all the explanation of the method and so on. How long does it take me to do American history in 1 year? Of course, it takes me a whole year, right? So, we go over a lot of things more than once, but yeah, it takes a long time. All right. I think that should be it for tonight. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. And so I appreciate this opportunity to discuss what I do. And so thank you for being here. And I wish you a good night. Bye for now.